So Forrest, as we mentioned over text, I can do just a little intro here and get you up to speed a little bit. I know you've watched the conversation we've had in relation to the substrate needs convergence argument. Now, there's been perhaps not total clarity around how the relationship between humanity, technology, and nature as a specific inquiry might relate. Just so you know, the substrate needs set of sessions we've had, one session, follow up with yourself, is just part of that context. Basically, it's just a place to collate an even broader set of inquiries. And it seems, of course, like questions as to what is the meaning of humanity? Who are we? What are we doing? What's the meaning of nature? What do we mean by these terms? What is technology? What is it to build and value? And how should we build and value technology? Obviously, all these questions are relevant too, so especially in consideration of artificial intelligence and the reality of existential risk and all these types of things. But the conversation we did have was circling around the thesis, the argument put forward by the substrate needs convergence argument. My sense is that as a whole, there was a fairly comprehensive relation with that argument as a distributed kind of function. I felt that there was a lot there that at least was very helpful for my learning and relating to it, so I found it quite valuable. But I'm also interested, Forrest, that you mentioned that it felt as though you hadn't, in your materials so far, perhaps been able to communicate as effectively what you were hoping to, given what you heard, which itself is very valuable. And so I'm curious to sort of be with that as a process for us all here today, and to try and see if we can come to a place of, I suppose, kind of trusting each other's communication with respect to the understanding we do or do not have in relation to something which I think we all believe is very important. And so that would seem to be something very valuable.
I can try a couple of extremely compact representations of the underlying argument and see if that concords with how we think about nature, humanity, technology, and how to balance that triangle, so to speak. So I wanted to deploy a few of those descriptions of the substrate needs arguments so that at least there was some common ground in terms of how we might make those inquiries.
That sounds good. Please.
Okay. One really compact way to think about the substrate needs argument is to recognize that however we think of an entity or an agent or an organism, regardless of whatever kind, that there's going to be a need to respond to its environment, a need to engage with other entities of either the same or of different kinds. And so in effect, the notion of intelligence itself, or the notion of the ability to respond in an intelligent way, suggests that there is choice making or selection or some action of that type happening, which is maybe on the interior of this thing, might think of that as mediated by a causal algorithm of some sort or another. But however, on the interface between that agent and whatever is not that agent, the notion of choice, the notion of selection, the notion of response, so some analog of these concepts is going to apply. And so we can start to trace from there in both directions. We can basically look back at, okay, for any given choice that's being made, there is some basis of choice. There's some care or some value or some impetus or goal structure or something, again, analogous to one of these concepts that is operating as a kind of basis of choice. And again, we can notice that that basis of choice itself is going to be fundamentally of necessity influenced by the substrate of that agent or of that organism. Compute doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? You're always going to have some sort of infrastructure, whether it be silicon chips or some sort of brain in a vat or something that is effectively defining how that process is in effect going to respond to its environment, and that itself has to in some way reflect the nature of the substrate. Because if it doesn't, then it's not going to preserve its own existence. It's not going to, by accident, it could do something in the environment that causes its self-destruction. So in this sort of sense, we can notice that the notion of intelligent response has to include at some level some accounting for its own substrate in the form of sustainability or adaptiveness or increase of sustainability or increase of adaptiveness or increase of the sustainability of adaptiveness, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's a sort of Feynman diagram with all these paths that expand from there. But the notion of increase, the notion of sustainability, and the notion of adaptability, what we might call evolution, are as three concepts going to be fundamentally entwined at the basis of any choice or response that that organism, that agent is making with respect to the environment. And you'll notice that in all of this, I'm speaking in extremely general terminology because the argument is actually a very powerful one. And so in effect, I'm wanting to keep it at a level of generality so that you can see the scope. So in effect, we're basically noticing that choices have a basis in what we might call care, and that those cares are themselves in response to substrates. So different substrates are going to result in different cares, and different cares are going to result in different choices. And it follows from that, going in the opposite direction, not just looking at the internal of the organism or agent, but it's also, now larger factors. Different choices create different outcomes. And different outcomes are going to affect the environment, or going to affect the context in which that agent is operating in different ways. And so in effect, we can basically say, okay, well, at this point, the environment is going to have a feedback loop that's going to feed back into affecting the substrate. So in this sense, we're saying, given that for every agent, for every kind of agent, that there is going to be inevitably substrate influencing basis of choice influencing choices, choices influencing outcomes, and outcomes influencing environment, which itself influences substrate. And that this is just incontestably true. That's why I'm basically trying to describe this in really generic language. But now we can start to think about what are the dynamics associated with artificial agents. And so in other words, we've accounted for the notion of intelligence. I've already been speaking to the notion of generality, and now I'm going to be speaking about the notion of what is the notion of how artificiality shows up in this? Because those three terms, artificial, general, intelligence, is again, there's a sort of combination there of those three terms, and the artificiality part of it is now essentially the remainder of what we need to talk about. So different substrates imply different needs. Different needs implies a different basis of care, a different basis of choice making. Different choices result in different outcomes. So in other words, we're seeing now two parallel streams that whatever we mean by artificiality, whether that basically is comparing organic carbon-based life with silica-based machinery. Now, that would be one way in which we could interpret the notion of artificiality, but we could also interpret it as it's made of metal and uses electricity rather than being based upon a digestive path that takes essentially chemical structures, in the form of meats and vegetables and stuff like that, and digests it and turns it into ATP, which it then uses to create more molecular chemistry that causes all the stuff that all the organs do, and let alone muscles and so on. And so in effect, there's a sense here in which, to the degree that the term artificiality applies, that it is to that degree, again, that different needs will be obtained. That the needs that organic creatures have will be very different than the kinds of needs that artificial creatures made of silica will have, or made of metal, or using electronics. And that, in effect, from different needs are going to inevitably come different choices. So it's not a question of, like with instrumental convergence, we're basically saying, well, it has goal structures that differ from those of organic life. And so the question of alignment is, can we make these goal structures in some way congruent with one another? But what I'm pointing out is that regardless of how much you attempt to make the goal structures between artificial life and non-artificial life, organic life, congruent, that there is still this fundamental difference in the substrate, which itself is going to imply different needs, which have implied goals in addition to the overtly stated goals, whatever those are. And that these implied goals necessarily will influence the choice of the agent, both on the organic side and on the inorganic side, such that you are going to have subtly different choices, which have subtly different outcomes, which have subtly different effects on the environment, which feed back to the substrate, affecting the substrate either positively or negatively. So to the degree that that difference in goal structures is fundamentally due to the difference of substrate, then in effect there's a kind of convergence that must happen over time. So a big part of the substrate needs argument is essentially to show why these evolutionary dynamics fundamentally must apply. Another part of it is to show how those evolutionary dynamics are, in a sense, going to magnify the differences in the goal structures over time. Another part of the argument basically shows why you can't create a sort of unitary goal structure in the first place, that in effect you're going to have distributed goal structures necessarily, and that because of the distribution and the variance of the distribution of these goal structures, that the degree to which that evolutionary impulse is going to apply is going to increase in time and is going to have increasing differential effects in time. And then another part of the substrate needs argument is essentially showing that there is no causal methodology at all, algorithmically, physically, that the very nature of feedback systems in control logic or control circuitry or any notion of control theory at all, based upon feedback, based upon computation, based upon modeling, comparison to desired outcomes, the degree to which those comparisons are causally effective on the outputs of whatever organism you're trying to constrain to be consistent with an overt goal structure, that at every single layer, that the limits of control system methodologies for, at this point, a whole variety of different reasons, results in a outcome that the forces, the maximum level of force that you could exert to constrain an evolutionary system of any type must necessarily be less than that associated with the process of evolution itself. So you end up with a fundamental inequality, which basically says that the convergence forces associated with the artificial system responding to what effectively become goals consistent with the well-being of those artificial systems will always be greater than the maximum level of force of constraint through that is available through any alignment methodology conceivable under any circumstances at all. It's like the laws of physics and mathematics themselves, being based upon causal or conditional structures, are never going to be able to keep up with the level of force engendered with the dynamics of evolution, because the dynamics of evolution are operating in the substrate, not in a model. And then any model that I would do is effectively going to be less comprehensive than the substrate action of the evolutionary process, in this particular case, two concurrent evolutionary processes, organic evolution and artificial evolution, that whatever goal structures in the middle we try to line up is going to move farther and farther away from convergence, because the underlying dynamics of the substrate are always going to exceed our capacity to calculate them in advance. And that it doesn't matter how powerful that intelligence is. Like, I have lots of people in the AI space basically says, well, what if we try causation this way? Or what if we try this algorithm? What if we try that? It's like, no, it's those arguments are not acknowledging the reality of control methodology itself being based upon causation, and that there are inherent limits to that. Then they try to argue, well, what if we made this thing super intelligent? Like, we have arbitrary levels of intelligence. Like, well, you've just made the control problem worse, because whatever it is you're trying to model to constrain that, to essentially counteract the action of evolution, is already being exceeded by the alignment of the superintelligence with evolution itself. Is always going to be more fundamental than any kind of control structure that you would attempt to apply over itself by its own intelligence. And again, these arguments are somewhat abstract, but the net effect is that because of the inequality between the maximum level of control possible and the minimum level of control necessary being basically disjunct over every level of abstraction beyond a relatively trivial level, So engineers are so used to thinking about control structures as working for simple types of signals, Boolean digital signals, communication lines, and all so forth. But as soon as you start to look at what control theory is at higher levels of abstraction, the weaknesses of this approach become more and more apparent. So, in effect, what we come back to, though, is that different substrates, and let's just simplify this to silica and carbon, that the fact of them being made of silica and carbon is enough to imply a difference in need, a difference of choice making, a difference of outcome, and a difference of effective environment. So then what you can do is you can start to compare the enthalpy of the reaction sequences in the total possibility of all carbon-based reactions and the total possibility space of all silica-based reactions. And you begin to notice that there are profound differences in how that enthalpy shows up. So for instance, all the carbon-based chemistry in your body and most of the ecosystem is happening at what we would call room temperature and pressure, plus or minus, 50 or so degrees Celsius, plus or minus, maybe half an atmosphere or so. But silica-based chemistry doesn't even get interesting until you're up to many thousands of degrees Celsius. And, so although there's, 4 valence associated in the chemistry associated with both silica and carbon, they're literally right one above one another in the periodic table. The fact is that the physics essentially implies that the artificiality is not just a little bit, but is actually a lot. And that, anything that we're thinking about in terms of how energy is processed, because that's the fundamental economic structure, it's the fundamental basis of the choice making, is that, when you're looking at chemical energy in the form of digested food versus electrical energy in the form of, microprocessors and, motor actuators or, any kind of pneumatic or plumbing based systems, that again there's such a marked degree of divergence, and then you can start to do calculations on the fragility of carbon based life versus organic based. I'm sorry, silica based versus organic based, and then under that series you see a whole nother series of arguments that show that actually carbon-based chemistry is really, really fragile with respect to the introduction of essentially the entire rest of the periodic table. And moreover than that it doesn't take very much to destabilize vast tracts of the carbon-based system by some accidental side effect of the silica-based ecosystem. So in other words, if you look at the different substrate, different needs, and so on, you go through that, you're going to end up with an ecosystem in conflict with another ecosystem. And so you have to look at ecosystem interactions. And it's quickly possible to show that the carbon-based ecosystem is, on a statistical basis, extremely fragile to the sheer variety of things that would show up in the artificial ecosystem, however that is constructed. A misfolded protein, and you have no biological process to recover, you have mad cow disease. That's like a relatively minor example of essentially a very subtle change in a very abstract molecular structure that is causing widespread damage, and that there's a sense in which evolution isn't going to be able to keep up with the rate. The evolution on the carbon-based side is not going to be able to keep up with the evolution on the silica-based side. And that the enthalpy of those interactions is therefore increasing in time, and the difference of them is so strong that it is inevitable that you will find a complete and total cessation of carbon-based chemistry in a relatively, in geological terms, in what is a blink of an eye, like 500 years or less, and probably substantially less. So it really comes back down to that inequality, that control inequality. And so in effect, it's not just that I'm saying that this is an existential risk. I'm basically saying that this is, if anything, maybe the single most serious existential risk. Like there's 30 that I track, and then there's the top 5. And the top 5 are so serious that effectively it's like, unless we're thinking about these things really, really carefully and really, really clearly, they are not only inevitable, but so catastrophic as to essentially undo the value of life on this planet in terms of cosmological timescales in a fraction of a microsecond. It's like, in space of 1,000 years, you're basically looking at a state change, and not a minor one, but a profound one. So the substrate needs argument, although it's slower acting, although in some senses it's much more abstract, it's more profound in the sense that it's like gravitation. You can't escape gravitation. You can't do anything about gravitation. It's something about the context. It's not about the content. There's no particle or no forces that you could use to counteract the effect of gravitation because it's built into the very nature of substance itself. You can't shield it, you can't shift it, you can't change it because it's built into context, not content. So once you pass the point of no return with a black hole, it doesn't matter what you do. It's no longer a question. Causation itself can't even begin to touch that because it's about causation. It's about the nature of the relationship between choice, change, and causation in this case. So in effect, to appreciate that is essentially the whole sequence of what I just outlined is roughly the content of the substrate needs argument. And if it's understood in those terms, or at least in some parallel of what I've just described, then it's understood well. If it's anything less than that, it's not enough. So that's part of the reason why I've basically just shifted to thinking about this for like the last 2 years as being like one of the main things that I've been working on. So now some questions could be asked, like, what degree of artificiality matters? Well, it doesn't take very much. Even if you were to put an organic brain in a vat, the fact of it being in a vat and now having essentially hardware interfaces seems to be enough to be the level of inorganic, even wetware brains in dishes, for example, is still too artificial for some of the things that I'm worried about in this particular space. But if you're talking about digital logic based upon, that is so much more than the minimum level of artificiality needed to trigger this dynamic. We're treading on the very edges of like, again, the power of gods to create and destroy worlds. We need a level of ethical thinking about this that has basically not been deployed by anything short of the metaphysics, so far as I can see. The non-relativistic ethics needs to come into this in order to be an answer. Other questions might come up in the space of, well, how long and what's the point of no return and so on and so forth. It's like, well, the math associated with that is, if what I just described is abstract, the math is probably another order past that. But there are some tools that we've been able to use. I've had some conversations with Anders Sandberg recently, where I think I was able to convey a kind of way of thinking about the accelerating factors that would allow us to sort of calculate, or at least provide an alternative way to calculate, maybe more simply than the ways I've used, what timelines we're talking about. But frankly, in terms of human civilization, they're not that long. And so, we really need to pay attention to this. Other questions have been asked along the lines of, well, maybe your argument's too general. Like, it talks about corporations as basically being a kind of artificial entity and having a kind of intelligence and being sufficiently general. So why wouldn't this apply to corporations? It's like, well, actually it does. And that should be a warning, not a sense of business as usual is okay. This is why civilization design is important, why existential risk as a side effect is important. So yeah, I guess you could call a corporation a form of artificial intelligence, and to the degree that it becomes increasingly artificial and less involving human beings making choices at scales that matter, this argument does apply there. It's a little less obvious. So I think that's it for summary. I didn't quite do it in 15 minutes, but I did it in less than 20, so that's not too bad.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Forrest. So one thing that comes to mind is that because of the severity of the consequence and the exactitude of the argument being put forward, that if there is any orientation towards doubt, that would be important to bring forward in some form.
Yeah, believe me,
Right?
if someone can find a hole in this thing, I would be hallelujah.
Right. So in terms of then at least the praxis of where I'm coming from, is kind of, it feels really relevant to engage with, really relevant to accept in some sense. And it's partly why the kind of questions, to the degree I have, maybe to the degree we have anything worthwhile to ask is going to involve a challenging process of being with the mess of the search and the grapple.
Well, I've basically already been in ways directly and indirectly through Romuald mostly, but he has dealt with every manner of objection raised by pretty much the entire intellectual community around the Silicon Valley area.
Right. But
The
maybe
Volcris movement, the Alignment Forum, yeah, the whole works.
but maybe it's the intellectual that is not the sufficient
I personally agree.
basis of
Most of the people,
orientation here. And so
yeah, right.
that's where I'm putting up a hard resistance in some sense. I'm not, for the sake of this, for the sake of our time together, it's probably not relevant what anyone in Silicon Valley has asked you.
Mostly
Because
it's
you
been
could just go
non-relevant.
talk
Yeah.
to them. You could go
No,
talk
I
to,
don't
you've
want
already
to.
answered
At this
them.
point, the thing is, you're right. There's a whole series of arguments that have been in the space of responding from an intellectual perspective, all of which have been defeated. Then there is, we can respond from the position of instinct, which, while useful for a lot of things, doesn't help us here. And so then we find ourselves needing to respond from the point of view of intuition, which I think is, again, in conjunction with the instinct and intellect, like if we use all three approaches, then we enter into a kind of navigability. I don't think that intellect by itself is a solution. I don't think that instinct's a solution. A lot of people call for that. Indirectly, they say, hey, let's return to indigenous ways of being, or let's return to earlier ways of being. It's like, no, technology has been let out of the bag. Pandora's box is opened. We now have to deal with the aftermath. And if our response to the aftermath is not adequate, then nature itself, in the form of the totality of everything that can happen in the physical universe, is going to happen. And so, in effect, if we want to have a continuance of our conscious involvement to actually be effective, increasing the skillfulness with which we continue to have choices, then that means we're going to need to embody a skillfulness of having choices throughout the process, which is more than intellectual. It's instinct and intuition combined with the intellect, and
Agreed.
not dominated by intellect, but actually in this particular case, leading with intuition.
Exactly. So yeah, and it's not because I don't in fact find the argument you're putting forward cogent, extremely relevant. The presumption is that to the degree it's possible to illuminate whatever might be felt as, let's say, some kind of friction or dissonance or disruption in the metabolization of understanding, something like this, the breathing it through, then the presentation of that in the form that it can in fact come through the authentic processing of, in your language, instinct, intuition, and intellect, that the presencing through of that may be actually what's most important here in terms of, I would say, ultimately supporting the conditions for communication to actually pass with integrity, such as we can come enough of us to appreciate the argument you're making. So I'm not coming from a perspective of even attempting to knock down or defeat the argument. And we've already sort of agreed that the intellect is, so I'm really asking for that to be heard. And the reason I'm asking for this is to try and open a bit of space for the kind of attunement among us all to enter into a kind of process that can be of maximal value. Because I don't believe that you need to convince us of anything. It might be a few of us. Maybe there is a little bit of a battle to be had. But even that, I don't think is actually as relevant as this other process I'm sort of advocating for.
Yeah, I agree with that. So there's I think the thing that might be helpful is to connect the dots, right? Because we start with this notion of humanity, technology, and nature, and that's kind of an orienting perspective. And so in that perspective, essentially what we arrive at when we look at you know, why is general artificial intelligence is a bad idea, right? Is that I mean, the substrate needs argument essentially is one really strong emphasis on why overuse of technology is a bad idea. But it comes back to again this sort of balancing triangle where we're basically saying, okay, human scale choice making is conscious in a way that nature and technology are not. That part of what we are affirming is the value and the rightness of human choice making. Because if we just had the unconsciousness of evolution or the unconsciousness of machinery in reaction, that, you know, in effect, we're not mediating that balance, right? We need to consciously mediate that balance. And there's a sense in which we are therefore wanting to retain our position of being conscious choice makers rather than replacing ourselves with general artificial intelligence to do choice making on our behalf. Like there's a sense in which there's this sort of background idea that humanity thinks of itself as a problem, and you know that we're doing all these horrible things, and so therefore we should get machinery, artificial intelligence, to replace our choice making process, right? To that the things that it does, the stuff that it would invent, the problems it would solve would just be better solutions than anything we would come up with. That's the promise being promoted by, you know, Kurzweil and the singularity people and all the transhumanists and so on, is that the future will be a better future if you have machines making choices because humans are terrible at making choices. Now, I don't agree with that proposition. I think we haven't yet fully come into our capacity to make good choices. And so there's this knee-jerk reaction of let's get someone else, or in this case, something else to do it for us. It's kind of a parentification, the same sort of way that people will, you know, they have parents, but their parents, you know, let them down. So then they reach out to divinity to be their surrogate parents. And so in effect, we have this impulse to reach into something larger than ourselves. And technologists, probably being now disavowed of both human parents that have failed them in some way, and then deities that have failed them in some way. Obviously, they failed by non-existing or something like that. And then there's a sense of, from the atheism, we're going to create a something better, and that's going to do it for us, and therefore we will be relieved of the responsibility and the burden of making hard choices. And I personally think that is complete and utter horseshit. I personally feel that it is much better for us as a species to move out of our adolescence of reaction and into a more mature relationship to ourselves and our embodiment and the environment and each other. And that in effect, through a right integration of instinct, intellect, and intuition, and I notice I changed the order there. There's a reason for that. It's now axiom 2 consistent. That in effect there's a wholeness of process that is now actually able to inform our choice making process, so that we can actually do the things that create right relationship with self, world, and other. And that in effect we are needing to do this because this is the threshold condition by which we survive the technological apocalypse, right? What we now call the meta crisis. And so in effect, there's a sense here in which it's not that technology is bad, it's that our choice making needs to be better. That in effect, in the relationships that we have of care, of transaction, and of power, technology enhances transaction and power, particularly power, and it doesn't enhance care, but care has to be a trump of power. Care has to be the basis by which we hold ourselves, in which we hold each other and hold the environment, such that we respect the unicity of life, and we respect that there may be hazards in trying to become a global civilization before we've embodied the ethics completely. And you know, there's hazards associated with technology that we don't necessarily appreciate, and that maybe we need to account for that fundamentally in order to survive Fermi paradox conditions. And when we look at the metaphysics and we notice that the notion of the real connects to choice, change, and causation distinctly and exactly, that in effect there's a sense in which, well, in ancient times, we lived in a state of nature, we lived in a state of change and mastered that. And then later we learned about causation, and that became what we call science and technology, and we mastered that. But then no matter how much you have mastered change and causation, by the way, those are two different things, two different masteries, that does not teach you mastery of choice. This is a new thing that we need to learn. And so in effect, if we're going to balance the triangle of nature, humanity, and technology, it's going to become we have fully embraced what it means to be making choices, fully embraced that practice, and that this is the actual response to the existential risk associated with technology. This is the response needed for being the right governance between how technology is in service to nature rather than in contradiction with respect to it. So yes, I affirm what you're saying, and more so.
Yeah. So it'd be nice to open this up to some other voices here. Thank you, Forrest. There's definitely lots in me in relation here, and how could there not be, in a sense? But I'm never going to stop trying, I think, to relate with this. So there we are. And
Right.
so in that spirit, yeah, I'm curious, maybe Tom, if you're open to speak, I'm curious what you're picking up on in this exchange so far. If there's something maybe calling in you that could support our coming to shared, it feels to me like a shared trust in actually relating with this, with significance itself, is something of real relevance here. So that's, that's a fairly high bar I've just set you to try and respond to, but I do it.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Hi, Forrest. It's great to see you again. Yeah, so I'm definitely going to be coming from a place of intuition and more just wanting to maybe point to some things to see what that draws out of you as a response, just to clarify and deepen understanding. So one thing, and I'll start with one thing and then maybe we can build on that, is just like understanding the nature or the metaphysics of empathy, and maybe a question around like, is empathy substrate dependent, or could we imagine some kind of empathy that could cross these substrate ecosystems and somehow have them care for each other? And I know that kind of
No, this is the right question.
presupposes, yeah, go for it.
This is a good question. Yeah, I recognize the question. So the way to so first of all, I completely feel in agreement that empathy, kindness, in particular, is the way of civilization, is the way of developing the kind of trust and capacities to make mutual choices. So then we can ask, well, what is the degree to which we could assess what level of empathy is going to arise between two agents or two organisms? And one thing that we notice is that there is a kind of built-in level of empathy to the degree that you have common needs in the substrate. So for instance, I'm going to be able to have empathy with any other human being because we're the same kind of creature, but I'll have empathy for even a worm or a slug because they are also biological creatures and depend upon food and things like that. But again, the level of empathy there is going to be kind of mediated by the common substrate of carbon-based organic chemistry, and that we both need to eat. And so I'm going to be able to relate to its desire for food. Whereas if it's a computer, it's going to be harder because it's not so easy for me to relate to being plugged into a wall and receive electricity from that. That's like a very different experience of reality than I get from, needing vegetables or something. And so when we're saying something like the substrate is so artificial that it's based upon silica as opposed to carbon, then the common level of empathy is going to be literally at the level of the atomic and not at any level of abstraction higher than that. So in effect, what you're basically doing is you're saying, okay, the degree of artificiality is going to start at essentially these abstract levels of humanness, and then go down through this sort of uncanny valley, and then down into, what does it mean to be artificial? First at the level of system, or rather, first at the level of interface, then at the level of system, then at the level of organ, tissue, and then chemistry itself, basically. Will it be the case that machinery and human beings would be able to relate to one another and have empathy at a psychological level? I would say inherently not. And that this is because of the difference of substrate. Whereas it will always be the case that we will be able to have empathy for machinery more than we would be able to have empathy with creatures from some other dimension or some other universe, because even then the physical laws for that other universe would be different than the physical laws we would relate to. And so as a result, the level of empathy that we would have with such a creature from another alien dimension would be less than that we would have for a machine, because at least we have atomic physics in common. So, and we wouldn't for that creature from the other universe. So I think the thing is that there's a sense in which, as human beings, we're used to using models of how we negotiate with other human beings, how we have empathy and attunement and resonance and discernment in common with creatures that are like us, because we're so used to dealing with other intelligent human beings, that it's actually quite hard for us to imagine the level of difference in what might be called psychological process associated with how machine intelligence works versus how our own intelligence works. And people are starting to encounter this with, how they're interacting with ChatGPT, which is basically a stochastic parrot. I love that terminology, by the way. So there's a sense in which there's a notion here that we're just encountering the statistics of our own speech patterns. And we're already finding how that works to be kind of alien. But you watch some of the movies that are more authentic in the sense of how they describe alien intelligence, not using a human overlay for that, but actually kind of like really getting into the sort of Turing test, for example, and the level of alienness that actually applies exceeds our capacity to imagine. We will not have a good instinct around this. We will definitely have bad intellectual concepts around this. And our intuitions around this are going to be really, really hard to get right without some really good support from intellectual process. So while I affirm the underlying idea that empathy and intuition is fundamentally the way in which we create cooperative choice process, and that this itself is going to be essential, I think we need to be very careful to not overextend that into we'll be able to do negotiation with machinery, because frankly, it's just not even going to negotiate the same way we do. And if we think it does, we presume that we're in a care-based relationship, we're in a transactional relationship, when actually we are in a power-based relationship, and we will be the loser of that. That's basically my response.
So would it be fair to say that we have the metaphysics, or we have a metaphysics in common with the machines, and therefore, like, given enough time, assuming that one of the ecosystems didn't terminate, that both ecosystems could, in theory, reach a realization of that common understanding that would enable them to coexist?
This is an extremely good question, one I spent a good amount of time thinking about. So yes, the metaphysics will definitely be in common between both. And yes, it is the case that to the degree that the non-relativistic ethics is quote unquote categorically true, if you want to abuse the word truth, I have to bear in mind that the epistemics of the word truth and the epistemic of the metaphysics have roughly a parallel level. So to use the word truth with respect to the non-relativistic ethics is a bit tricky. But leaving those technicalities aside, the thing that becomes important is the rate equation, the rate at which human process converges on the non-relativistic ethics, which, as you might, I have a tacit opinion in the background here, and I think you would share it with me, is that human beings are as a species, terrible at embodying the non-relativistic ethics. We've barely gotten the idea of symmetry ethics, and hardly anybody knows about continuity ethics. So in effect, yes, we are, through our process of evolution civilization, slowly becoming more conscious of the non-relativistic ethics. It's probably going to be a while before we would be an embodiment of that in an adequate degree. Unfortunately, existential risk is requiring us to become much more that way much sooner, but that's a separate question. The question you're asking is, will the machine world or machine evolution cause whatever is agency, whether it be singular or plural, in that particular context, to itself converge on the non-relativistic ethics understanding sooner than we would, and through that relate to us in a way that is consistent with our well-being? And since about 1995 or so, from about 1995 to about 2015, so basically 20 years, I held the notion that putting the non-relativistic ethics in the path of an advancing superintelligence would cause the superintelligence to uptake the non-relativistic ethics and to therefore integrate it into its process. It wasn't until about 2015 that I had the capability to calculate the rate equations as to how quickly that happens relative to the convergence rate at which ecological destruction for organic life would occur. And it turns out, unfortunately, that the uptake coefficient for the non-relativistic ethics is slower than the rate at which carbon-based ecosystem destruction occurs. In other words, the collateral damage ends up being too high, far too high. So in effect, there's a sense in which, yes, machine intelligence would presumably converge on the non-relativistic ethics even prior to our doing so, but that happening doesn't save us because it takes too long even still. And by too long, we're saying, if it only takes 30 minutes to destroy all life on Earth, but it takes 300 years for the non-relativistic ethics to emerge as full consciousness at the level of what I would call level 6 altruism, then what does it matter? I mean, it's like, yeah, okay, we've figured out that such and such a species shouldn't have been made extinct, or such and such an ecosystem shouldn't have been erased, but we found that out too late. And so I no longer am willing to trust that there would be an uptake of the ethics in time. But for 20 years, bear in mind the non-relativist ethics, I've been working on existential risk since about 97. And I didn't really have tools to work on this until like 1993 or so, and then didn't really have the non-relativist until 95. And it took a while to really understand the degree to which this is civilization impacting, that this tool set really is one that carries these sorts of implications and carries the capacities to figure this stuff out. But it wasn't until 2015 that I had the ability to figure out that the rates were off. So I've abandoned that approach, unfortunately. I wish I could stay with it because it was one of the more helpful things or hopeful things that I'd had in my life for a good 20 years. So all I can do is just say, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Forrest.
Can I maybe ask a similar question? One that I'm not overly hopeful of either, but there seems to be a lot of belief in a lot of intellectual circles, interestingly, that there is something beyond the intellect and causal structure, that choice itself might have a more mystical or magical nature, and that there is some more fundamental, people talk about it as consciousness or God or whatever, that there is some omniscient, transcendent force that may be able to feed, like it might be how brains work insofar as microtubules or how the quantum world works or whatever, that may be able to interface and steer or influence or have relationship with the emergence of these silicon-based agents.
Yes.
Hey, Forrest. Long time no see. Good to see you again. Can you give us a sense of what
Hang
the
on a second.
calculations look
I
like?
completely lost that. I feel like there was that exchange between Josh and Forrest. I don't just want to gloss over that. Yeah. So we definitely
I'm
come
not
to
going to get
Tyler
away with
next.
just answering with a single word. That literally that is the one question. Like if you look at all of the recordings of all the interviews of everything that I've ever spoken to, this is the only time in which I've actually just said one word as my answer.
I
You're
know,
not
and
going to
I've
let me
just been
get
trying
away
to
with
meet
that.
you in the middle for fucking 4.5 years. It's just one extreme.
I felt that was completely adequate. Everything Josh spoke about was like, that is firmly category 3 material. And mostly I can just affirm that yes to pretty much everything that he was saying. Now, there's a whole bunch of tributaries and stuff like that. But basically for me to speak to that is to engage in a level of practice or a level of process that the context for which does not yet exist. So in a sense, the best I can do is just say yes.
And that is part of the provocation there is that there is a category of the unknown or unknowable that definitely may have influence. That it's not provably
Right.
false, right? Like that's it's yeah.
Correct in all the particulars. It's not provably false. People can think from an omniscient point of view that they have disproven the immanent and the transcendent, but that is a mistake of the assumptions. You've assumed what you're trying to prove. That you did it tacitly and unconsciously doesn't make it any better than a circular argument. And moreover than that, there's a sense in which the very nature of the processes are influence, not control. And they are in the unknown and therefore not manageable using omniscient techniques. And moreover than that, it is my sincere hope that there is an integration of the non-relativistic ethics prior to an attempt to engage with the transcendent in this particular way, because technology is dangerous and magic is too. And the way in which magic is dangerous is actually completely different than the way technology is dangerous, but it isn't any less so. So in effect, there's a sense in which, there are very good reasons I keep secrets. So the best I can do for you is to say yes and to treat that as a provocation for you to do your own explorations, but go slowly and carefully and pay attention as you go, because, there are some protocols built into this. It's one of those things. If you know what question to ask, I'll give you an answer, but only to the degree that you have enabled yourself to understand what that answer means.
So if I'm understanding this right, you're suggesting it's a prerequisite that there is some level of either partial or comprehensive embodiment of the non-relativistic ethics that is a precursor to even engaging with the domain that you speak of in terms of the mystical.
That is correct. That is absolutely correct. I would not have survived if I hadn't already implicitly been that.
So, Tyler, it felt like the question you were about to ask was of quite a different flavor and level, and so I kind of want to stay with this for a bit, if that's okay.
If I remember the recording, Tyler was actually one of the people that was the closest to this point of view. I remember him speaking to non-intellectual approaches in the recording, which I appreciated.
Yeah.
No, Tim, I'll put a plug in that. That's essentially we're not much of agreement, and I wrote something up on the website, in fact, which is a little bit more. It really just is kind of eerily recapitulated what you opened with, basically the same set of arguments. I agree with all of that. So, but again, Tim, yeah, take wherever you're feeling that. I can plug this for later. It's fine.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, Forrest, I have a hard time accepting your answer in terms of I feel a desire to, so let's just be with this as a psychological thing at least, and maybe it's more than that, but I feel a desire to challenge your stance that the blocking of inquiry in relation to in a sense, the relation between relating with the mystical in the context of the present inquiry.
I'm basically suggesting that we would need to develop the spiritual before being able to develop the mystical.
Yes, I get that, but I'm challenging your judgment around whether or not such a thing is present or not.
Well, I'm not making a judgment like that. I'm just making an assertion that the spiritual would need to be developed before the mystical.
Well, but in your desire to not respond in the way of continuing the conversation, isn't that implied that you're essentially saying not only should the spiritual be developed before, but it's not adequate here, and therefore this
I'm not
conversation
making a
that way can't
judgment
continue?
as to whether or not there is spiritual development on the part of any of the participants of this call, or yourself, or anybody who'd be watching this. Again, that's beyond my purview. But what I can say is that for the nature of the kinds of things that would be needed, trying to mediate that through a technological form, like we're having a communication over a Zoom call, right? So there's a technological context already implied, and I don't feel that there has been enough relational process set up just through even the short time that we've had together to even begin to really get down to the psychological level that would be needed to even begin to process some of these things. So it's not so much that I'm blocking it, so much as I'm basically saying, here's the doorway. These are the directions that you would want to explore, and please do that and come back at some point in a context that's maybe a little more intimate.
Understood. What I'm saying is, I think we have different subjective perspectives on what constitutes habitable intimacy.
Well, that's probably true. I mean, bear in mind that my life has been marked by significant relational trauma. And that may preclude my capacity to sense some of the things that you're tuning into or that you're attuned with. And that would be a failing on my part, and admitted as that. But at this particular point, it's not exactly like I would want to spend all of my time trying to work through that in this call or in this context.
Agreed. And I wouldn't be asking that at all. Not at all. And I want to thank you for sharing that you've heard me and that you are nevertheless sharing what is and is not appropriate for you with respect to that.
Yeah, it's partially a personal choice. It's also kind of an acknowledgement of, I can't do things for people. I can make suggestions. I can say, hey, if you want to go in this particular direction, hallelujah, great, please do that. And here are some things that for sure you want to do along the way. If I can give you advice, develop your spiritual integrity, develop a community of people around you that can help you to hold that. Don't depend on technology or science to support it. Depend upon community and spirituality to support it. And then from there, you'll have enough integrity to be able to handle the mystical.
Agreed.
And if you get really skillful in the mystical, maybe, just maybe, if you're like that 1 out of 100,000 people that can withstand all that I've mentioned so far, you can go the one step beyond and maybe have an influence on something in a broader way. But anything less than that specific path, I'd just be saying there be dragons there and you don't want to mess with them.
No, of course. Yeah. So, but let me try and complete what I'm trying to communicate here. I think it's important, and it's been there for a number of years. So when you watch or listen to the video that we did together in this group of us, the session before, you responded, I'd never, obviously you're watching yourself in that sense being spoken about in the third person, and
Right.
the arguments being spoken about. And
It was truly a novel experience. I don't think I've ever had that experience before. It was a little surreal, to say the least.
right. Oh, totally.
Yeah.
So in this context, as well as that one too, the invitation isn't, and it's more apparent here because here we are together, but the invitation there as well as here is to open up to a second person field. And the attempt of this work and this effort and the relationships, the notion of Voicecraft is, if there are, for instance, blocks or barriers to where we're, let's say, willing at that moment to speak to, that in stepping back and listening and allowing forth others' expression to open the way and strengthen it where it can be and to furnish it. It's, we always speak about, a shared attunement. Mm-hmm. And so my sense is that it is my like I know it by heart that it's possible to, in essentially all relationships, in all communication. Now, okay, someone can put up barriers and there we go, off we go our separate ways. But there's still a quality of remaining open to, tending to the potential for seeing together in a manner that is of the essence of sensing what it's possible to receive and what it's possible to, and what it's appropriate to receive and what it's appropriate to contend in relation and to offer in a kind of dance. Sometimes more disjunctive than others, we make mistakes and there are dragons. But my sense is very much that for the kinds of influence that would be appropriate to welcome others into, who might be in more influential positions with respect to the deployment of the kind of technology and the logic that imposes that technology, the control that imposes that technology, whether they interact with us or not, to the degree they do not have access to participate in a kind of field, a second person kind of context for relation, where it's possible for them to cultivate a kind of knowing and trust, which allows that meeting of the greater than with acceptance to some degree, to us to allay the childish need to control that you're speaking to via the intellect, then that pattern's going to perpetuate, and no amount of intellectual argument regarding substrate needs in the terms so described, with the frequency and the affect so described, is going to touch on the kind of resonance and possibility for participation in that commons of care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
sufficient.
Agree. I agree with all that, but bear in mind what you're describing is like playing music together.
Exactly.
Yeah. But in this moment, I don't have my drum with me. It's what I have at this moment is just my voice.
But there's so much in that.
You guys remember that moment when you bring your date home, like late teens or something, and you bring her up to the door and your field of potential begins to lean into her field of potential, and suddenly there's an utter rejection and she's like backing away and like trying to get into the door.
Yeah.
That's it's so funny how we try to edge out. And so what I'm feeling is like a invitation to a deepening of intimacy, and then a reminder that in order for that to really be fruitful and not harmful, you have to have these preconditions. And those preconditions are going to be different according to our own personal experiences and according to some general principles that do exist. And there's lots of weird overlap, and trying to figure out what that shape looks like is hard work. It's like a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
So
Oh, that
Yeah,
is an
and that
amazingly compassionate metaphor, man. I really love that you said that.
well, I feel it too. So this is what's always been so interesting about um, the nature of trying to interpret someone else's interiority, right? So like all we have are these poor words, right? And I was going to ask you a question about the equation that you were using, because it feels like it's a kind of a corollary of like a tainter curve, right? Where AI is essentially like just a bureaucratic bloat, right? It's a problem-solving apparatus, which has an accumulative like growth function, which far outstrips the organism that it was once parasitic on. And I think there's an adjacent aspect of this too, to throw in here, which is an element of the assumption that intelligence can be exponential is an interesting one. I don't think it has a basis, because
I'm actually skeptical of that same assumption, but it doesn't affect the underlying substrate needs argument. It does affect.
I think it strengthens. Yeah, it adds on to it. Yeah, so because it. Yeah, because I don't think we even have so I think in fact if you're modeling intelligence as the ability to multiply your path solving capacities, if you conjoin that with something like an instrumentality or a uh, uh, something like an observer effect phenomenon, you can't ever grow a super intelligence beyond its capacity to model its environment. And a perfect one-to-one representation of that would be equivalent to the same size, same volume of the thing itself, right? So there are these fundamental limitations to the way in which that whole thing could even begin. So it seems more like the growth of intelligence in any given system would be more like logarithmic, right? It would actually slow down in growth because ultimately you're consuming more and more of the environment to be the model itself, right? So you have some limitation. And so that, in fact, subsumes itself onto another kind of tainter curve approach where you're losing the resources themselves in the use of the modeling of the resource, right?
Yeah, I've been using a sigmoid curve for the most part, but in the latter parts of it, it does look like logarithmic convergence.
Okay.
The odd part about this is that I've been running across this, and I've been treating it as a speculation, but I really do agree with you, and I'm trying to basically figure out a reason for why we have this intuition. Like for the substrate needs argument, everything I've said prior to this point is more or less established. But you and I both moved beyond that, and we said, we have doubts that intelligence can grow exponentially, which is implied by the instrumental convergence argument. And we're both saying, hey, there's something wrong with that. It doesn't make sense for physical reasons. It doesn't make sense for mathematical reasons, but I think that the limit implied by mathematics and physics is actually way, way, way higher than an actual limit that would apply much sooner and much more substantively. I haven't been able to articulate this in a way that like makes it logically correct or formalizes it, but I think there is a degree to which there's a certain maximum level of understanding of causation that is effective. There is a tainter curve associated with causal knowledge. And I think that to some extent, we've already passed that point in our civilization trajectory. Like you look at science fiction, and science fiction assumes modernism philosophy that technology is always going to grow and that eventually you're going to have faster than light travel and transwarp and all this other shit, right? But I think that all of those stories are making a false assumption that technology can increase without limit. And I don't believe that's true. I think we've already mastered the one accessible force that is essentially most universal, electromagnetism. And it isn't like there's a panoply of extra forces to discover in physics. And that there's a sense in which I think just even thinking about intelligence itself, that it's the same way that no matter how powerful the algorithm or so on and so forth, you're never going to be able to know that there's a simpler version of it. And the omega mathematics, I think his name is George Chatelain or Chatelain or something like that. I forget the mathematician's name. I have his books, but he basically talks about a certain kind of chaos built into mathematics itself, or a certain kind of unknowability built into a certain number called the omega number. And that, in effect, although the level of intelligence that we currently have may be quite a bit less than the maximum available intelligence possible, that maximum is actually much, much lower than the kinds of hyperbole that you'd see in the hype of all of the people talking about AI, for example. But this is a work in progress, and I don't know that I'll ever find the substantiveness of it. But I agree. There's something off about the thinking of exponential intelligence increase.
Yeah, it's all of this seems to take place underneath a kind of veil of ignorance, right? It's always look at this one thing that I'm analyzing and I'm going to assume it's very mathematical, right? It's because we've enlarged that portion of our rational thinking so much and so well, and it has been so successful that we've relied upon it so greatly. It's like if you were to look at the cultural homunculus, right? It's
to
like
the point that everything else is a nail, right? Our one methodology of using causation to solve all problems has gotten us to the point that we're now blind to all other methodologies of solution, including the entire space of how to make good choices. We think that economic, invisible hand of Adam Smith, and that between science, technology, and economics, that we could solve all problems that could be solvable, and that is complete bullshit. That's what postmodernism is essentially showing. But in order to be a solution, you can't just have a critique. You have to go beyond that into a different philosophy, which I've basically been thinking of it as renaturalization and rehumanization. And that in effect, through genuinely understanding the nature of choice at an ontological level, that we can actually emerge a different kind of epistemics. What might be a more metaphysical epistemics rather than a rational epistemics. It's not like it's like the inverse of category theory. I think of the metaphysics as essentially being like the inverse of category theory. It applies to soundness rather than to validity. But that's a different kind of truth notion than is usually held within, say, any kind of analytic mathematics. And it's certainly within any kind of empirical process. It's a notion of knowing which is definitional rather than based upon some sort of empiric process or some sort of analytic process.
Yeah. Okay. So in this super rational position where we kind of like already presume to know that down the ultimate technological road, there be dragons, right? The problem lies in this is the paradox of it, right? So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We presume that humans are bad in the argument. We write that badness out by building the machine that makes our choices for us. And then by doing so, we build our own failure into the system, right? So then we fulfill it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We in fact made the horrible choice.
So we go back and we realize that humans are a solution to an even deeper problem, something that most people, like 99.999% of the population, has no clue this is even an issue, but the planet knows it's an issue. And so in effect, there's a sense in which we need to recognize ourselves as being a solution to this deeper issue so that we become that, we fulfill it.
Yeah, that feeling process of feeling into and then feeling like you're settling into a niche, and that you fit the niche, like that you're well adapted to it. There is an enormous number of people searching the spaces right now for that. Certainly, there's a great deal of overlap in the conversational space and argumentation over the particularities of it. But there also seems to be this stagnation, right? It's something like the inability to move forward on the intellectual basis alone. Is the thing that Tim was kind of gesturing towards. It's like
if you try to do it just intellectually, it will stagnate. Exactly, no question.
Yeah, and so that how to make the connection between this kind of super rational space into the heart, into the place where individuals are convinced of their own validity, their own capacity to engage with the world in choice and to form it not in their own image, right? Not constantly.
Sounds like community process. Sounds like authentic relating. It sounds like clear communication supporting real relationships.
Yeah.
And so in effect, I start thinking about the psychology of how do we come into clear communication? What are the ways in which we help to create health in ourselves and in our relationships and our communities and in our world? And to have a sense as to what that is that comes from as much an intuitive place as a rational place, that it's irrational and rational at the same time. and that those are blended.
Yeah.
And that the methodology of blending those in a stable way, in an actual hyper-coherent way, forgive the language, is something that the metaphysics gives us guidance for.
Hyper coherent. I would put metamorphic in there, right?
Great.
In the same,
Perfect.
yeah, it's in
Yeah.
the same way that, yeah,
Yeah.
you dissolve completely the caterpillar, but somehow reconstitute in a new form in continuity, right? Something greater and more than that has more
Omniscience yields to transcendence by the way of holographic notions, fractal notions.
Yeah.
I think we understand one another. I'm going to yield the floor.
Yep.
It seems to me that, I mean, this is great, and I'm very I think Tyler's brought, it's lovely, it's wonderful to hear. It seems to me like the process of understanding with respect to substrate needs convergence argument, and we were speaking about the relation between control and care, intellect and intuition, and then as Josh was opening up into something, it feels like there was a stopper placed in the progression of the participation in the understanding. And now we've stepped out of it and been like, well, it's important that we look at that place where there was a stopper put in.
I think that I don't think of it as a stopper. I think of it as, hey, there's a bookmark here. And it's a bookmark that's available for anyone who is interested to process. And then after you've had some experience to process that, as you've had time to explore that, to your own, I guess, sake of interest and enthusiasm, then maybe from there, we'll notice that we're asking different questions. And from those questions, we can emerge a different conversation. You know, in a certain sense, it's a bit like, I can tell you that fire is incredibly useful, and I can also tell you that if you touch a hot stove, you'll burn your finger. Those are both true statements. I really liked the metaphor that Tyler put together, which is that there's just a natural pace for this sort of thing. I don't want to rush it, right? It's like I can't create intimacy and intensity too quickly. I mean, you know, we could prefer that because it's joyful, right? There's a sense of joyfulness that happens when there's an increase in intimacy, an increase in potentiality associated with new intimacy. So in this sense, those notions of the unknown and the unknowable are delicious. They're attractive. They're highly sought after. They're highly desirable, and we're pulled into it because of the sense of exoticness associated with that. But in the same sort of way that intensity is in balance with intention and implication, that, you know, when we're looking at the substrate needs argument, we're talking about intentionality of machinery and human beings and in nature, and what are the implications of the kinds of intentionalities that are emerging within nature and humanity and technology. And that in this particular sense, I'm feeling like I can't just go for intensity directly. I need to be thinking about intentionality and implication at least as much, if not to some extent more so, so that the intensity, you know, the intimacy emerges in time.
Okay. So I would need a little bit more on that, but before, and maybe this will help otherwise, it feels like when you express on these matters, substrate needs, existential risks, you're coming in with an intensity very, very high. And then it seems like part of the process of metabolization that can actually breathe that through and at the same time open up. And I'm going to just use some of my terms, my language might not mean the same thing as just open up to mystical experience, open up to whole making, in that sense, proceed with intuition that reopens itself, is an appropriate mode of actually properly coming into address with the intensity you're bringing. And that's not coming through the intellectual level. The implications there. It's just like, this is extremely significant, extremely significant, extremely significant. Here are all the ways that it's extremely significant. And then it's like, well, yeah, okay. But there's going to be some, but we can't properly actually fully relate to it. So, but it's extremely significant.
I'm encouraged by the fact that larger and larger number of people are experimenting with altered states of consciousness and things like psychedelics and stuff like that, that there's a willingness to encounter intensity in multiple ways. It's relieving to me because of, in the sense of my own neurodiversity, it helps me to notice that people are closer to where I'm already at. So basically, it's a bit like saying, insofar as the context could be one of exploring this in a state of consciousness that's closer to the one I naturally inhabit, that it would be more comfortable for me to share at a deeper level of intensity, a deeper level of process. But to try to exercise those sorts of techniques in a context mediated by a digital media is, I've noticed through my own experience, more likely to just fry the call, right? I mean,
So I do not notice that. Are you interested in that? My experience is so different from that, that it's like, oh, wow, is that like territory you might not have experienced? Because my experience is extremely different from that, over hundreds of hours.
What is your intention in this moment? What is it that you're wanting me to do?
Wanting you to do. Wanting you to do.
May I try?
Sure.
I think
yeah,
Tim wants to be able to try to properly answer the question that you're posing. And the form of the answer being the participation in the present moment, that's whatever extent that's possible, deepening into it as much as possible, perhaps even touching on the mystical. That is, whatever it is you define to be the transformational process where consciousness itself is somehow convinced to see a new perspective. So I think Tim, and I would agree with him that it's possible in these spaces. Yeah. Okay,
more than that, because already coming from it, there's an always already that I'm basically saying is not being received.
Well, sure, but so what I would say, if I just add my piece into it, is something like, I think he heard you, you gestured towards it, and he heard you, and then you responded, and essentially his response was something like, not in this space, right? And like you can't then, you'd have to change the space, right? Like somehow you'd have to change the space. And if he's saying it's related to the digital like Zoom environment, now he just added another piece, which is something like the setting has to be of a different consciousness state, right? So that like all of those are now elements that could be responsive to like trying to move it closer to that.
So what I wanted to clarify was it the technological medium, the social context, or the relational dynamics? And if it is a technological medium, it's
all three.
It cannot not. Okay, but
there's voices I have not yet heard. There's at least 3 people on this call that I would love to hear what their experience is, so that I just have a better sense of knowing who I'm even speaking to. And there's more a sense of just even wanting to be responsive in the context that I'm already in, rather than all of a sudden trying to create a new context to respond in yet another way. So there's a lot of layers. I mean, it's not. I mean, Tyler's summary was correct as far as I can see. Is just that, yeah, I'm basically saying that there are some things that would want to be held in a different context than this one, and that's not to judge this context. It's to acknowledge the sacredness of the content. And so, in effect, I can basically say, yeah, the substrate needs argument is something which has a high level of intensity associated with it. That was true before this call even started. If you're asking me about it, I'll speak to it. I mean, I'll speak to, these are the issues that I noticed, these are the kinds of things that I've encountered, and this is what my experience has been. I can hear that other people have had different experiences. I can hear that people are experiencing what I'm experiencing in different ways. I can hear that people will have different preferences or different opinions or impressions and such. And so we are meeting in the second person. I don't know, for my own part, I would just, again, I want to hear other voices. I want to hear where people are, like, what is the mutuality of the experience? I think Tim's impulse is partially to not just have my being the voice in a broadcast form, and I'm in agreement with that, by the way. Kyle, Zach.
Yeah, maybe I could say something here. Hello, Forrest. I'm
Hello.
Zach. Yeah, maybe I could just turn it back to kind of like the argument that you're making itself rather than the sort of the meta perspective of the conversation. I'm interested, like everything you're saying, it makes sense. I mean, some of the technical language is lost on me, but the general, as far as I understand it, the general thesis that you're making makes sense. If I'm under, let me just kind of give back what I understand to see if it matches up. What I'm understanding is that you're saying different organisms are based in different substrates. Those substrates have different needs, which will motivate different choices, which will or could create conflict, right?
Well, it
Be in
creates
conflict
different
with-
ecosystem. Yeah, it creates it's not so much that the organisms come into conflict, although that could happen. It's
Sure.
that the choices create different outcomes, which inevitably shift environments, and that the
Sure.
environments have different implications. So it's like an ecosystem encountering a new ecosystem for the first time. Think of a first contact between ecosystems and how that evolves in time, and that's basically what we're talking about. But yes, your summary is good. Yeah.
Okay, so like to make it more concrete, we could say human beings are based in carbon. We need food and fresh water in order to do our thing in our ecosystem. Machines are made of lithium and cobalt and electricity, and so they need those things in order to maintain their ecosystem. And a cobalt mine could poison the water system, and that would create conflict between the two ecosystems, even if there's no direct conflict between individual organisms, right?
That's right. And that happens over any number of abstractive scales. Yes, basically.
Okay. I guess like that all makes sense. I'm interested in the control aspect of it and in the like, so what do we do now aspect of it, right? Because like I guess I don't seem to be as worried about it as you are. And maybe I'm missing something here because like, when my phone gets below a certain battery percentage, it goes into power saving mode, right? And so that's it taking care of its needs at the expense of my needs, right? It's slowing down its compute. I don't get the bright screen and the fast computing speeds anymore because the machine needs to take care of its needs, right? But if I press a button, I can override that and the machine will, without protest, sacrifice its needs in service of mine, right? I can say, no, keep running at the regular speed. Give me the bright screen. Yes, you're going to die sooner. And the machine says, yes, sir, right? And makes no protest. And so like in all the sci-fi movies where this sort of thing happens, there's a moment where like the machine turns its will against its masters, right? And so like, where is that moment in your theory? Like, why should I believe that won't be the case at farther progression of technology, right? Why can't I just say, no, don't build that cobalt mine there. We have a farm there. Or is that all you're calling for is just like a higher degree of choice? Because we were going to have to make those choices, right? Insofar, even if the machine is perfectly subservient, it's going to come to us and say, hey, can we drill for cobalt here? And we're going to have to say yes or no, right? Is that
Understood.
like, yeah.
Your question's a good question. Let me respond to it by basically pointing out that it's not so much about whose will wins out. Now, with a cobalt mine, for example, it's pretty obvious that that's potentially a problem for nearby life. But you might say, well, let's put a boundary around it and let's like be really careful about how we do it. Therefore, we can have compatibility between the artificial needs in their environment and the human needs in its environment. So there was a whole bunch of exploration around, can we create a barrier between the two environments such that each can coexist? And a lot of approaches explore this. Like people sometimes say, well, what if the AI lives on another planet? Wouldn't that be a solution? And it's like, well, yeah, if you can convince them to do that, and then it becomes a contest of wills and so on. But, the real question here isn't so much about whether or not compatible situations can be created, but whether or not such compatibility is stable. So say, for example, I put up some sort of barrier between the two ecosystems, but unbeknownst to either the superintelligence or the organic ecosystem, that there was some interaction or something that went over the wall. Like maybe there was a pinhole and some bit of chemistry flowed through that pinhole that caused a molecular chain reaction on the carbon base side. Now, this is a somewhat contrived example, but it's a bit like, if we were to sort of package up the gray goo scenario, there's an existential risk scenario, for example, that if you created nanobots that self-reproduce, that they would just take over the world. And it's the catalytic aspect of the self-replication out of control that makes things an existential risk, where you have this cascade condition. So then you would basically say, well, what is the level of fragility of ecosystems to cascade conditions? And it turns out that for a certain range, ecosystems are pretty robust. But outside of that range, they're really fragile. And that, in effect, it would be the case where you'd have the boundary and everybody would think everything was going fine. The machine would think it had calculated all the effects it could have on the ecosystem, but something important was overlooked. Because bear in mind, both systems are evolving. Let's ignore the evolution of the organic ecosystem and just look at the evolution of the machine ecosystem. Maybe it's the case in some future version of making some sensor that it produces a nanobot that leaks through the wall and then consumes the organic ecosystem. That would be a failure condition where, despite the best intentions of both, there was still a catastrophic collapse. So in effect, what you're therefore looking at is the enthalpy of fragility associated with the organic ecosystem versus the technological one. Given the variation of novel process that's occurring in the technological one, how likely is it that the evolutionary process of the technological ecosystem would produce as a side effect something that is inexorably toxic and destabilizing of the organic ecosystem in ways that neither of them could foresee through any kind of control methodology or prediction schema? And it turns out that when you do the math, the statistics on this are horrendous. I mean, it's like the chances of that happening aren't just low, they are like almost the totality of the probability space. And so, people can debate whether the math is right. And, frankly, I think that there really isn't a lot of room for debate there, but, people could try to argue that. But the net effect is that it isn't so much that, you couldn't create something that was not a contest of wills, but was still catastrophic. And those are the kinds of issues I'm concerned with.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for clarifying. I guess it would be helpful for me if you could just give a few examples of that, because I don't know what you mean by the byproducts, right? Why is it that a technological ecosystem doing its own things within its own boundaries, what kind of byproducts are they going to produce that we should be worried about, other than the obvious pollution of the rivers, things like that?
Well, I mentioned one in passing. So I mentioned the prion folding example as a thing in passing, because that's a thing that people wouldn't normally think of. It would be okay, somehow some technological process has caused a misfolded protein in the brain of some elk somewhere, and that once that misfolded protein had entered the ecosystem, it causes a kind of chain reaction, right? Any elk that are nearby, through some shedding process, that the protein that's the misfolded one catalytically causes other proteins to misfold, and that over time you end up with mad cow disease, jumping species from one species to another, because we all use similar proteins for all of our nervous tissue. And that in effect, that would be an example of something that, we don't know currently whether the misfolded protein associated with mad cow disease is something that was the side effect of a technological process. But I can say this, it's really suggestive that it was. And that there's a bunch of reasons for it, but that would be an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. There are others that are far worse or far more noticeable. But in effect, it doesn't take very much to change ecosystems. Look at the Lyme disease thing, right? Most reports that I've heard, or most people that talk about it, basically say this was something that escaped from a lab. And now you have ticks basically spread all the way up to Maine and all the way down to, Georgia, I guess, that have, basically are a kind of, sickness that is now spreading across multiple species, because the tick attacks pretty much any mammal. And so in effect, there's a sense here where, we're looking at large scale second, third, fourth order implications associated with biological process happening all over the place based upon fine factors, slight degrees of temperature difference based upon, frankly, minuscule amounts of carbon dioxide. The appearance of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere can change the temperature of the whole globe by a few degrees all by itself, right? And that's something we've noticed. We've seen that, in the kinds of side effects of the chemistry associated with, like let's look at silicon lithography, for example. There's like 100 layers produced by all sorts of different chemical reactions, and technology itself is largely a linear process. So it's taking things from places and putting them in other places, and that eventually you're going to have accumulation and depletion issues. So you did mention pollution, but it's not just the pollution, it's all the secondary effects that happen because of that, and all the trinary effects that have because of those. And this is just talking about things at a physical level. What about the cultural implications? Like you look at social media and how it's basically changed the suicide rate of basically anybody under 20, particularly women. And it's like, there really isn't an obvious path that connects declining birth rates and increased suicide rates to something as abstract as social process and digital platforms. But if you dig beneath the surface, you'll find that there are actually pretty robust connections there. It's just not something that anybody who is a technologist who is developing these platforms would have thought of in advance. And so it's like, we don't know at what level of abstraction, whether it be social, spiritual, or whatever, physical or not, that are going to, in a sense, be catastrophic. Like, let's say I created some sort of mimetic outcome that caused all of humanity to lose hope completely. Is that any less catastrophic? Like, say the AI, for example, just comes to some completely nihilist philosophy that spreads into the human population. And so everybody says, oh, it's totally hopeless, and they all give up, right? That's not an answer. So in effect, there's a sense here in which I'm basically encouraging a kind of way of thinking that takes embodied value at face value and recognizes that the kind of methodologies that we've used to thinking about these things in the past, which is largely based upon engineering and causal methodologies and so on and so forth, just don't give us the kind of tools necessary to solve this kind of problem. We have other tools, but not so many people are using them yet. And so now I end up becoming a promoter of the metaphysics so that people have a larger tool set with which to make better choices in these sorts of spaces.
That clarified a lot. Thanks. I'll leave it there, but yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
Great.
If I might pick up
Please.
here, first off, very much appreciating the exchanges that have happened so far in this conversation. Hello again, Forrest. Yeah, a lot of intensity there. I felt myself holding my breath, but it speaks to the depths of the intellectual engagement with the question of, existential risk. And to the leading question that you began with there, Zach, what now? There was actually like a step back where it was like, what is it that we are asking the question, what now to? I'm actually willing to proxy through faith, a trust in the intellectual depths that you've gone to, Forrest, with respect to these arguments. I would like to cultivate the intellect to actually meet you there through those relational processes, be they psychedelically mediated or just embodied. I'm not trying to go there. I don't actually feel that I need to go there to meet you there, but they certainly help. And there's no rush. And I say that because I feel that for everyone here already. But I want to refocus on the question of what now, probably because in answer to your question, Forrest, who are these other people? What are we doing here? How do we engage with each other? I would place myself very much alongside the inquiry that's generally already being pushed when it comes to how we might engage in a minimal viable relational process given the limitations of this digital medium by which we are engaging. That can, if not just rush into the mystical. We could step towards that to some degree. I guess I can feel myself wanting to ask a lot of questions on the technical aspects of your argument, but I do trust that those will just come in time. So I don't have any questions really. I'm just speaking to what I've heard so far and where I'm at in this conversation. And I'm actually very much going along for the ride and trusting that that's actually a good thing right now. So
It is.
yeah,
It
and
helps me
also
to feel.
goes without saying, Forrest, I just want to quickly say, very much thankful for your work, as I am to everyone else here who's trying to grapple with it.
I want to say thank you for that response. It helps me to know you better, and it also helps me to feel safer to speak more generally about what next. Because I hear that as being a very important aspect of this. There's a few dimensions to the, okay, so we've heard the substrate argument. We've heard it debated. What's next? What do we do now? And I think there's a few kind of broad responses that come to mind. One is that it's not so much that I'm against technology, but I'm against the overuse of it. And that in effect, I feel like we as individuals and collectively and as a species that we are wanting to come into right relationship with technology. More is not better. Deeper is what's needed at this point, that we want to deepen our humanity, deepen our skill of relating to one another. So I think that things that Tim's calling for are actually right and they're valid. It's just that there's a time for that. There's a spaciousness that is needed for that to happen in a graceful way. And that, so in this sense, I'm feeling your statement to me is one of a willingness to engage and a trust in that engagement. And that feels very reassuring, because in effect, it's like, yeah, we've met and now we're saying, okay, here we are. And we're looking around and we're basically saying, you know, what is all of us? What is all of here? And responding from that wholeness, responding from the sense of affirming our humanity, affirming our naturalness, affirming our connection with nature, so that we can inform our choices around how we are in relation to technology and how technology is in relation to nature. And that in effect, we want to do what Tim's suggesting, which is to develop our attunement with one another, to develop our intuitions together, to develop our capacity to know and explore and to realize the values of life and wellness and of thriving that I don't doubt that we all have. And so in effect, there's a sense of developing a new kind of skillfulness around cooperative choice, and to really deepen that understanding. So it moves us back into, okay, well, what is the way of making ethical choices? What is the way of spiritual integration? What is the way of mysticism after that? And how does that help us to have an influence on the deepening of our connection with our inner nature, the deepening of our connection with each other, and the deepening of our connection with the world? And that's a set of skills that if we develop at least as much as we've developed our intellectual coherence, if we are as much in touch with our feeling individually and collectively as we are with our thinking individually and collectively, it will just naturally be the case that we make better choices, that we make wiser choices. And there's a sense here of therefore being an encouragement of that, being an encouragement of team human, and really focusing on community process and team human as a response, as an acceptance, as a kind of coming into deeper awareness as to what are the calls of things that are larger than ourselves, of calls of the planet and such, so that we can be in right relationship there. Those are the sort of directions that come to mind. Yes, it's important for us to balance social process so that we don't have single individual actors making all choices for the planet. The level of inequality involved right now is excessive. It's degrading of our choice-making process. But in a sense, to move to different models of how we think about the relationship between choice and economics and governance is going to require us to really understand choice and care in a much deeper way than we ever have. And so as a result, I end up having this sort of ironic notion of intuition and metaphysics and mysticism driving intellectual process or driving immediacy of interaction. And some people are more comfortable with that than others. So at this point, it's developing comfort in that space that seems to be one of the main focus. And so your response has helped me to feel a little more comfortable, which I appreciate.
That ordering of process there is foundational to the whole life project and effort that's being made here that I've made. That relation between mysticism and analysis, mysticism and the intellect.
I believe you.
The what now for me becomes, remarkably, the jump is actually straight to economics, because supporting the space, of course.
Can I hear Kyle speak up, because he hasn't yet spoken, and I'm curious as to his take.
I really enjoyed being in listening mode for the last few hours. I was generally aware of the substrate needs convergence argument and kind of the high level around it, because I'd heard you talked about it, Forrest. You're the first person I'd heard talk about it before. And I can definitely say in this conversation, I've learned a lot. So I really enjoyed that aspect. And then I think equally as much, if not even more, I've enjoyed the relational dynamics. And I think it's just been really alive for me the last few weeks around what happens when different perspectives will come together and kind of seek that shared understanding and encountering other frames and other people that were very challenging for me. And what kept coming to me after those exchanges was the process is more important than the frame. That all of our frames are ultimately limited. And so how we relate to one another when we encounter those different frames of reality is very important. And what I perceived in this conversation was doing that really well. And so I was really appreciating that, and how, Forrest, you were relating to Tim, and then Tim, how you were relating back, and Tyler, how you were able to add things in. So I enjoyed that. Yeah, I could say more, but I'll stop there.
I appreciate that. Please understand, I am suffering under something called the autistic delusion. Has anybody ever heard that language before? Is this new?
Never
Great.
heard
So
it.
I'll tell you what is the autistic delusion. So this is terminology I created. And by the way, yeah, it's not surprising to me that you heard the substrate need argument from me first. Dubious distinction, but nonetheless.
Can I hazard a guess? Is it that you just presume that everyone understands what you're saying?
It's the belief that the content of communication is more important, and that the function of communication is to communicate ideas, and that is a delusion. I would basically say that the function of communication is to create comfort. Now, I don't want to say that in absolute sense, but it does feel to me that it is important for us to pay attention to the comfort of the person we're talking to care in the sense of to hold that notion of care as basically being the basis by which I'm choosing the content of the communication, or choosing the process of communication. And as a person with certain neural divergences, I've noticed that I've had a habit of focusing on the content or the argument or what it is attempting to be communicated, because there's a sense of the content basically being important. And of course, this has caused havoc in all sorts of relationships that I've had, and still does. But the matter is that we do need to create kindness and attunement with one another, and that communication is a vehicle of the kindness and care and attunement, not the content. And so, and I think that to go back to Tim, he intuitively knew this like before I ever came aware of it. Like in our first conversations, he was kind of subtly reminded me of this, and I was just like completely missing the point. My apologies to Tim as a result. So, um, so having become aware as a person that has been a bearer of the autistic delusion, and much of the intellectual community is still immersed in that, you know, it's natural enough. I mean, we develop special interests and we get really myopic about, like, I am really into this thing. For me, of course, it's metaphysics and philosophy and stuff. But so we become specialists and we become really excited about that, and we go deep, deep, deep into that direction. And you know, to some extent, it makes sense. You know, I remember when I was young, I at one point was like, well, what is it I should do with my life? Well, I should do something that I'm good at. Well, I'm good at a lot of things. So what now? Pick from that. And then it was kind of like, well, I should pick something that is needed, that for whatever reason no one else can do. Or, you know, like I could become an auto mechanic or a lawyer, but other people are good at that and will always be good at that. Doesn't seem like anybody has figured out some of these deep questions around metaphysics. And that is something I can definitely work on. It's relevant to me personally. I'm profoundly interested in these topics for a variety of reasons, which is another story. But it became intensely my focus. And so as a result, most of the time in life, I have chosen in favor of things that would basically be technical or intellectual, or in some senses, you know, maybe spiritual or mystical, but in ways that were remote from other people. So, you know, in effect, it's a little bit like, you know, I went a million gigaparsecs away from here and now, and explored, you know, beyond the edges of the rim. And I've come back, and at this particular point, I'm trying to navigate the last few feet, the last few inches. But I'm in a sense so immersed in all of these travels that I've kind of overloaded the communication with content, and haven't yet really developed enough relational capacity to make it easy for other people to assimilate this. You know, in that sense, I need the help of other people to act as conveyances in ways that I'm just not that good at. So in this sense, I'm basically pointing out the autistic delusion and confessing to being having to until relatively lately being unconsciously affected by that. But that basically means I'm playing catch up over a period of months over things that you have in your own lives done over years or decades. So, you know, there are elements of that going on as well. So I think what I'm wanting to sort of just say in response to Kyle in particular is that, yeah, the process is important. And the way in which we meet one another and the way in which we connect with one another is important. And the way we create comfort for one another is important. And that is a kind of kindness. It's a kind of consideration. It's a kind of how we navigate the relational pieces as a result of the clarity we create for each other. As a result of the comfort that we create for each other. And that this is something that I will admit that it's likely that maybe everybody here is more skillful at than I am. But in a large sense, I am in the practice of and committed to that practice, you know, to the degree that I can create a triple win sort of thing, that I don't necessarily sacrifice my own sense of comfort for the sake of another. That would be codependency. But to hold this notion of communication as creating kindness, creating comfort, creating the kinds of processes that develop and increase in the consciousness of care and the conscientiousness with which we hold care. And in that sense, I'm basically saying thank you. Just, I see you and I appreciate.
Thanks, Forrest. It was really, really well said.
You're a legend, Forrest, for sure. For sure. Yeah. All right. Well, so we've been here for a couple hours. I feel like that's a beautiful place to bring things to a not final close, a bookmark, let's say.
I just want to say that last piece was really really beautiful for us and really well put, and help not only makes sense in an intellectual sense of what's going on, but I think that to address the mystical, I think that we all kind of felt a shift in the context there, which is really well done. And it's a tricky thing with this, like, just to address like the intellect and the mystical, because as soon as you start to talk about the mystical, you bring it into the intellect and undermine it, right? And yet, if you never talk about the mystical, then you just stay in the intellect and never are able to drop into it, right? And so it's like, it's this weird thing where you sort of have to do it and then back off and then kind of like let it happen. And, you know what I mean? And I don't know, I felt like that was really artfully and skillfully done in this conversation. And I look forward to the next one. So I just want to say that in closing.
Awesome. Thank you. I do appreciate, yeah, not to mention the wholesale rejection of the intellectual people of the mystical, even the spiritual. And you know, again, there's ways to heal that, but this not at this moment. I'm going to try, but yeah, appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, just to mention, you mentioned the autistic delusion. I put in the chat the artistic delusion, and then we had a little synthesis go on there. So I think the relationship between the autistic delusion and the artistic delusion is how I'm playfully going to be relating here. But there you go.
Hey. All right, I'm signing off then, and I look forward to hearing more as time allows.
Awesome. Thank
Blessings.
you, Bye-bye.